When running photographic holidays, I am sometimes surprised that the student is unaware that photographs, yes, can be taken into the light, or contre-jour as it is known. I have seen on social media alarming reports of cameras being damaged by this technique. I have not experienced this problem myself, even with the sun in shot, possibly because I stopped down to f16 or 22 on aperture priority. Although the camera could do this by default on program or auto, because there is so much light about, I never leave it to chance, so be warned, this program has a risk factor. Using a small aperture can cause other problems, particularly a reduction in image quality known as diffraction. A small aperture reduces the risk of flare, a degradation of the image that, in my opinion, is worse than diffraction. So the photographer, unfortunately, is caught both ways. And anyway, for protection of the camera, it might be best to always use a small aperture. There is also the question of protecting your eyesight, especially if the photographer takes time to compose the image. Whilst it is regarded as best practice to use a viewfinder, here perhaps is just one case where using a camera screen would be preferable. With this photograph, we can see several potential problems: flare, diffraction, and a burnt-out highlight that is beyond redemption. Another morning, and we have a different prospect. Now the sun is partially obscured by high cloud. Grabbing the opportunity, I quickly took the shot whilst the dynamic range was more manageable. Against the light, images need not be in your face. They can be subtle. Capturing detail in bright clouds and sparkling water requires careful exposure control. The photographer is still faced with a composition having an enormous dynamic range, which cannot be captured successfully by just pressing a button on program or auto. All too easily, highlights end up so overexposed that they cannot be corrected in post-production. The trick is to underexpose by spot metering a highlight and correcting shadows in Lightroom or Photoshop. This risks noise, but sensors are getting better in handling these extremes, allowing more flexibility in post-production, even for slightly overexposed highlights. Shadows, of course, become increasingly important when shooting into the sun, creating patterns of light and shade. With stained glass, the photographer is shooting into the light, but the absence of a direct sun makes exposure control a little easier, even though I tend to spot meter off a highlight. Back outside, the weather always has an important part to play. Early morning mist creates the magic of so-called angel rays. Again, spot metering is essential to avoid overexposure and loss of fine detail. But the boldest composition for shooting into the light is the silhouette, an effect that the eye does not always see. Now we are taking advantage of a weakness in the wonderful science of photography, the dynamic range between highlights and shadows. Here, the eye is far superior, but the camera has to choose between exposing for highlights or the shadows. The former is more successful. It creates a strong, underexposed foreground for a dramatic silhouette. I started by mentioning apertures and the importance of stopping down to f16 or 22 to avoid flare, especially if the sun is in shot. This is not a perfect answer, but preferable to avoiding excessive flare, degrading an image more than diffraction. If, however, you have access to a prime lens, that handles flare much better than a zoom, allowing the photographer to open the aperture to, say, f11 or 8, provided, of course, the light in the first place is not too strong.